Okay, so once the back of the blade is flat, we now need to do the following 3 tasks in order to complete our form of the sharpening process. We need to grind the primary bevel, we need to grind the secondary bevel, and we also need to remove the burr that's created during that process. So as you can see, we're using the Tormek here in the workshop, and what Graham's doing is he's actually using the diamond truing tool in order to true up the stone, but also to increase the speed of grinding. We do that really regularly here within the workshop. We find that the Tormek can grind really slowly, and if you use this truing tool regularly to resurface the stone and also to true it up as well, the grinding is much quicker and you achieve a fresh primary bevel pretty quickly. The use of the truing tool is pretty self-explanatory, so just follow the manufacturer's instructions on that. So having trued up the stone, the next thing we're going to do is take a look at the existing primary bevel on our blade. We want to check that it is the end is square to the sides. We also want to check the angle, and as I say, what we're demonstrating in this video is taking a blade with an existing 25-degree angle, which most of the suppliers supply the blades with a 25-degree angle, and going through the sharpening process from that as a starting point. We're using the Tormek jig. We've actually used we use a little magnet on the end of the shaft of the support arm there of the Tormek. That's just to stop the jig coming off the end of that shaft when you're sharpening or you're grinding. So what Graham's doing here is positioning the blade in the jig, and what he's trying to do is get that existing 25-degree primary bevel flat against the stone, so that when we start grinding, all we're doing is recreating the existing angle. We mark up the existing primary bevel with a marker pen, and we're going to use the evidence shown by the removal of that marker pen against the stone to check that we are actually flat against the stone, and so therefore when we start grinding that we're going to keep that 25-degree angle, and we're going to keep it at a right angle to the edge of the blade. So Graham's just marking it up with pen, gently rubbing it across the stone. If he needs to adjust it left and right, forwards and backwards slightly, he'll do that, and then he'll rub it against the stone again in order to check to see whether the marker pen is being removed all the way across the blade. And as we do a close-up here, you'll see he'll rub it and check, and that's a pretty consistent removal of that marker pen all the way across the blade. And so he'll just run it a little bit now just to double check that, and just to make sure it is actually grinding across the whole or as much of the bevel as possible. Of course, if you're resharpening here, because we sharpen or we create a slight curvature across the whole of the primary bevel, you might find that that is removing more from the central areas and not from the edges, and that's exactly what you'd expect to find. So now Graham's actually starting the grinding process itself, moving the blade across the stone from left to right and trying to keep as much of the blade in contact with the stone as he possibly can. You'll see that Graham's going to make regular checks of the cutting edge. What he's trying to find here is, or what he's trying to make sure here is, that the cutting edge is completely flat. We don't want any concavity at all in that cutting edge. We want a completely flat cutting edge at right angles to the side of the blade, and then we start introducing curvature. That very subtle curvature is just created by applying pressure on the edges of the blade, or rubbing the edges of the blade against the stone just for a few seconds, as Graham's just demonstrated. Now once you gain control of the Tormek, this is very quick and very easy. And now if he inspects again the cutting edge of that blade, what he'll hope to find is that he is starting to introduce a very, very subtle curvature across the edge of the primary bevel. He clearly felt that he didn't quite have enough at this point, so again, a little bit of application of pressure on the left and a rub against the stone, a little bit of application of pressure on the right and rub against the stone, and then remove the blade again and inspect again. It's important to state that this curvature is very subtle. You are actually only trying to create a gap, say on the left and right of the blade, of 0.1 to 0.2 millimeters, and if you can see, we're just using this adjustable square, or the body of a Starrett adjustable square, to inspect that visually, and you'll see that now we can rock that straight edge across the blade, and there is a very tiny gap left and right. This is a very controlled curvature across the primary bevel. So having produced that primary bevel on the Tormek, we now move to the Waterstones in order to produce the micro bevel, the secondary bevel. We use the Veritas Mark II honing guide to do this, and a series of Waterstones. Just make sure that the blade is actually held in firmly and tightened so that it is held by that bar consistently from left to right. And so when you've got it fixed into the honing guide, it's time to remove that angle setter and start the process of actually grinding our secondary bevel, our micro bevel. Now you can see Graham's doing some centralized strokes across the stones here. This is with pressure across the whole of the blade, not preferencing left or right. We generally teach that you do 4 central passes followed by 4 off-center passes on both sides of the blade. The idea with the off-center passes, and as you can see as Graham drags the blade across the stone, the blade is actually curving, which is indicative of us having a primary bevel with a curvature. So those off-center passes should mean that we create a micro bevel of consistent thickness across that subtle curvature. And if you look closely on the video at this point, you'll see that we've got a very tiny and very shiny micro bevel of a consistent thickness, and if we were to analyze the cutting edge at this point, we would see that it still follows that subtle curvature with a gap of about 0.1, 0.2 mil both left and right. Graham feels at this point that he just wants to make that micro bevel slightly bigger, so he's going to do 4 passes again centrally, and then passes both on the left and the right to make sure that we maintain that very subtle curvature across the edge of the blade. So we just finished with those final off-center passes, and then we'll take another look at the micro bevel that we're creating. And again, what we're looking for is that we've got a very shiny micro bevel, and this is using 1000 grit stone with these first passes. We've got a nice shiny and consistent micro bevel across the full width of the blade, and that will tell us that we are following the curvature that we created on the Tormek. We're finessing that curvature. At this point we're going to change over, and we would move to the 4000 grit stone. Same procedure again, centralized pressure for the first passes, then some off-center passes both on the left and the right. We do this and we move through the grits in order that the blade becomes sharper. We will do both 4000 and then 8000 before we move on to removing the burr that's created during this process. Another look at the edge of the cutting edge, having used the 4000 grit stone. Again, we should be seeing that micro bevel is even shinier. We're not removing a lot of material at this stage, but we are just checking to see, and as we slow down the video, we're checking to see that micro bevel remains a consistent thickness all the way across the edge of the blade. And again, we'll speed up the video as we change over the stones, and we'll repeat that process one final time. This is on the 8000 grit stone. Some people use 10,000, some people use a slightly lower number than 8,000, but we generally use 1,000, 4,000, and then the final passes will be on the 8000 grit stone. Same thing again, centralized pressure followed by the off-center pressure both left and right. What you should see on the 8000 grit stone, and on any of the stones actually, is that as you're doing that off-center pressure and you pull along the stone, that you are actually creating a curve, or that it's following a curve. You'll see that in the metal that's left on the stone itself. Final inspection again, and this really is the last time. We've gone through from 1000 grit to 4000 grit to 8000 grit. What we're checking for now is that having completed that process, we will still see that beautiful finessed subtle curvature on that secondary bevel. It's on the primary bevel, and now what we've done is we've created the micro bevel, and that should also follow that very consistent and subtle curvature. And that's a nice shot showing that beautiful shiny micro bevel that once we've removed the burr and fixed into our plane, will create some amazing shavings in the most difficult of timbers. Right, so having created the primary bevel and the secondary bevel using the water stones, we now remove the blade from the honing guide, and what we need to do now is remove the burr that's created during that process. You'll see there that Graham just felt for the burr and it will be very obvious to the touch. We're using the scary sharp system as we've done when we flattened the back of the plane originally, and we always use the scary sharp system for the flattening the back of plane blades, and also for backing off or removing the burr, having created that during the sharpening process. We do that because the scary sharp system on float glass is always flat. It's inherently flat. Unlike water stones that can be knocked out of flat and then need flattening again and again, this is always flat, so there's never a danger, if you use the right technique, of knocking the back of the blade out of flat, which is critically important to getting a really sharp blade. If you've read the articles in F&C or seen the previous videos on flattening the back of the blade, you'll see that we always use this pull stroke method. We cut those strips of about 70mm, we apply those strips to the float glass, and then Graham started with 15 microns, doing 15 micron micro finishing film, doing those pull stroke only strokes in order to maintain the flatness of the back of the blade and to remove the burr. He'll have gone from 15 micron down to 9 micron, and we generally stop at 9. Some people who are just obsessed with shininess will go down 3, even as low as 1, but in the furniture school and the craftsmen in our professional workshop generally use 15 micron if it's a fairly heavy burr that's been reground by the tormek with the secondary bevel and the water stones, and then 9 micron following that. Graham's again just doing a visual inspection. Sometimes he'll use a strop, as he's showing here, just placing the blade on the primary bevel, lifting it slightly, a couple of strokes on there, flipping it over to the back, a couple of strokes maximum on the strop, just to remove that burr and give us an incredibly sharp blade.